Are you about to do the REM? All normativity is presupposed by morality. Is that where we're going? Tell me right now if we're heading the car right into that wall. Marty.
Yeah, what's up?
Okay, what the fuck is morality? Can you tell me that? In like 400 words or less.
A sort of moral obligation to do the good.
What is the good?
So that's what this debate is going to be about. You wanted
here's my problem. Every time I talk to you people, you fucking moral realists, I get into this weird fucking world where they're basically trying to argue, well, normativity exists, right, dumb fuck? And I'm like, I mean, I guess so. That's morality. I win. And I end up having to, like, I guess moral realism is real because normativity exists. Like, that seems to be like every single like, I don't actually get any like, oh, well, this is a moral fact and this is how we know more. It's basically just like, well, you make any choice ever, don't you dumb fuck? That means you need to fucking have an opinion about something. You need to you need to point towards something, and in order to do that, you need normativity. Now you're moral realist, idiot.
True.
I understand your frustration.
Okay, well, what am I misunderstanding? Because that's what this guy's gonna do. I know it.
It would be something that I would also sort of do. I think the only alternative would be like to go for a form of ethical intuitionalism.
Okay, here's my here's the big one. Are you ready? 1 second. Here's my big one, okay? Okay, I'm gonna say a little bit of bullshit. All right, are you ready?
Okay.
Okay, so... okay, I'm gonna make some big claims. That might be bullshit. My understanding is that all human knowledge arises out of two things. That we have some level of, like, a priori reasoning granted to us, so things like deduction, and then we have, like, our our sense data, so like things that we see, hear, touch, smell, and that from these two things, all of our information comes from that. That's where we get all of our information. When I have a discussion and we're talking about the existence of objective morality, right, or the existence of moral fact, my big problem is that I don't have an organ to detect moral fact. I can't see moral fact. I can't hear it, taste it, touch it. Yeah. So my big problem is when we get into any type of intuitionism, how can I resolve dispute of moral fact? Because dispute in physics, chemistry, anything like that, I can. But how do you do for moral fact?
Yeah. So that's also a sort of argument that I've seen error theorists give, in the sense that they're going to pull out it doesn't seem as though we have a sense organ associated with ethical properties in the world. But there doesn't seem to be a sense organ in relation to a lot of things, a lot of sorts of properties within the world, right?
Can you give me some examples?
Huh?
Can you give me some examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, like, if there was a mountain in front of us, right?
Yeah.
And we were in a room our entire lives that's a 5 by 5 by 5, and then that person was let go maybe after 10 years of being within that room, and I was seeing the same mountain in front of me as as this person was, we would have, despite similar sense organs, a distinct answer to how far away that mountain is. He could not actually conceive of depth perception, right? He has to make certain types of inferences, meaning that there's some sort of inferential justification that goes further than just sense organs in order to detect distances of the sort. Also, I mean, like,
wait, can you break
a sense organ for a lot of theoretical physics, right? It seems as though, like, those are going to be.
Let's go one at a time. Can you break that example down for me? I don't understand what you mean. So depth perception is something that we don't have a sense organ for, or what do you mean by that?
Like, there doesn't seem to be, if there's some extra inferential structure that's going about when we're detecting the mountain as being actually miles away instead of 5 feet away, right? It doesn't seem like the sense organs that we have detected this distance, right? It seems as though there's an inferential structure that can detect.
But ultimately, that inferential structure is going to be relying on underlying sense data at the end of the day, right? You might see like a tree that you're familiar with, that you have like knowledge of, that doesn't appear to be as tall as it should be, so you think it's farther away, or you see the ground stretching before you. Like, at the end of the day, these all ground back in some empirical analysis.
That's an interesting refutation also given by some philosophers, and it might be able to work in some cases, but the point there being is that sense data isn't ever going to actually be the type of thing that does that, because there's always going to be, and you're going to hate where I'm going to go with this, but unfortunately, there's always going to be some sort of inferential structure that tells you that the tree ought to be 10 instead of 5 feet away, right? Merely causal descriptions don't have this property of describing a sense of normativity, or that ought basically being associated with it. Causal theories of reference, right, would just explicitly deny the statement that it ought to be this in this case. So mere sense data can't tell you when you're in error or when you're not in error, right? You need
Isn't that where some of our a priori reasoning comes from?
No, because I don't think it would have to necessarily rely on a priori reasoning.
Like if I become familiar with a tree, and I see a tree, and I become familiar with multiple trees, and then I go to make a prediction. Let's say that I see something in front of me or before me at some length away, and it appears to be a tree, and I've seen trees in the past. Can I inference, the distance that future tree would be as a result of a combination of my sense data plus like the innate reasoning that I kind of have? Isn't that like a valid like inference that doesn't rely on any type of like immaterial or spooky stuff?
Well, I mean, I think the point of inference is, right, we're justifying things through a relation or a battery of a belief. Already, so it sort of gets you into, I mean, whether you want to call this immaterial or material, at least it gets you into a world of normativity and a world of things that aren't just purely causal dispositions or just cause and effect relations, right? Because what we're doing here is we're not just seeing things, but we're justifying our seeings through propositional attitudes. And it doesn't seem like you can do a lick of justification without that form of inferentialism. Now, I think that from what follows from this, right, which is going to get into more complicated philosophy, which we might get into tonight later on with the ethical discussion, is that you're going to have to then install normativity in the world in virtue of this, right? Like, otherwise, I just don't see how you can ever rationally constrain your beliefs, right? There has to be something in virtue of which you rationally constrain your beliefs. And by this, I mean that you can't just have like free-floating beliefs. You have to have some sort of content, conceptual content that informs you what types of positions you should take. That is, like, the world tells you that you ought to believe in this as opposed to that, with even descriptive claims, right? Like with the mountain being this distance, it's telling you that it should be this distance as opposed to this other distance. So I think ought claims are also in epistemology, not just in normativity.
Can we argue? Couldn't you argue that normativity is an illusion to humans? That normativity doesn't actually exist, but it's like something that we kind of perceive. So, for instance, like if we were to like roll a bunch of marbles around, right, we would say, well, we need normativity to say where the marble ought to roll, but it could just be like following the whatever laws of physics that we've already established or that are established in the universe, independent of human thought, the same way that human going on a path or whatever could follow said laws, right?
Well, you'd need like a reductive or an eliminativist theory, but the point is that as soon as you find that theory, right, you're going to be trying to justify that theory and already getting into normativity. So you have to find
isn't that an irrational? There is a name specifically for this. There's an escape for this, where like saying that there are no absolutes. Like, that's a valid statement, even though somebody would say, well, that's an absolute saying there are no absolutes. But there's a reason why that can be a valid statement, no? Or if you say, like, oh, well, we can't know about things outside of our senses. And somebody's like, oh, well, if you can't know anything about outside your senses, well, how do you know there's anything there if you don't have anything to sense it? Like this, or something like that. Like, isn't there an escape for that?
I don't think that there is. And this type of skepticism that you're proposing seems to... and I might be getting a little bit deep in the waters if I keep going this direction, might presuppose the correspondence theory of truth, which not every philosopher particularly, I mean, I don't think that I would. I don't think that Rem would. I don't think perspective philosophy would hold on to a correspondence theory of truth, because then there's some sort of diametric difference or whole difference between our beliefs and how the world is, right? And it seems as though if we want to be rational agents, there has to be some sort of symmetry between how our beliefs are and how the world is.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, it doesn't seem that there is like an actual real distinction between our justified beliefs and how the world actually is. There seems to be a sort of identity between them. And if I'm justified at least in some beliefs, right, and presumably these beliefs have conceptual content to them that's normative, then the world is going to be normative as well.
Is that? Oh fuck. Okay, obviously this is past me. Is that necessary? Couldn't
Okay, it might be past me.
Couldn't this be like necessarily true of all things that can observe? Like so, like couldn't we say that like if there were creatures on the ground that perceived everything to be the color red, and then there were creatures on the ground that perceived everything to be the color blue? Like the creatures that are red would say, well, obviously everything in the world is red. And I mean, like, if we're going to be logical, we have to think that because, you know, our internal systems need to coincide with what exists in reality. Like, couldn't we just say that normativity or whatever arises because that's all we're necessarily capable of perceiving, or that's kind of like what we invent, but that's just like a product of our existence, not necessarily like a property of the universe? Does that make sense?
Well, but we are a part of the universe. I mean, you can't just say like these things are distinct from the universe themselves. If you want to say that we're, you know, if you want to hold on to a sort of thesis of human exceptionalism,
well, no, I'm not. Hold on. Maybe I'm explaining right. Or incorrectly. I don't mean anything about human exceptionalism. What I'm saying is that like, fuck.
Yeah, you just want to say that these things are sort of isolated as psychological events.
Yeah, but yeah, rather than like any actual property of the world, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, but I already gave you a reason for why that wouldn't occur. But I could
well,
go
but
for...
so the reason was that because it seems like these psychological events tend to align with reality? Is that...
Well, I wouldn't even call them mere psychological events, because mere psychological events presuppose the idea that our inner workings or our mental states are internal. But let's say you're an externalist about mental content, meaning that the content in the mind isn't just merely contained between your two ears, right? But that it had certain types of content that was obviously derivative from the world. But if that's the case, right, then the normative content that's within, the external content that is constitutive of our minds is also going to be some sort of content that's outside in the world. And it has to be, because how are we going to make sense of non-normative content through normative language? It seems as though that would be a sort of asymmetry that you'd have to deal with, if you understand what I'm saying.
Can you give me an example of like normative content that we wouldn't be able to deal with?
That we wouldn't be able to deal with?
Or yeah, when you say that like normativity is required to deal with certain types of content, can you give an example of that? What do you mean by that?
So I mean just that there's some sort of conceptual content in the world that constrains our beliefs and what we ought to believe, right? So like presumably the world has a set of determinate properties, call it X, right? And presumably these sets of properties are in opposition to other properties, not X. So what this content does is basically constrain what we ought to believe as opposed to what we ought not to believe, right? It gives us sort of guidelines for a sense of normativity, because the world itself is sort of normative. Now, if it wasn't, then it just sort of seeps into our minds without any sort of reasoning or constraint, right? Okay. It doesn't seem like content is ever like that.
Okay. From this place, so let's say that I assume that everything you said was true, that the world is constrained by some facts, that we ought to believe said facts, that X, you know, stands in lieu of not X, whatever. How do we get to morality from there?
Well, so the idea is that we're not going to deny that people are making moral propositions and have moral content, and that it's normative, because we're just, I mean,
all I heard was that we're just not going to deny it. What I'm asking is, like, how do we, like, what's to keep me from...
My next question is like, do you deny that we make moral judgments or that we have moral propositions?
Well, I mean, people have propositions that they call moral. What do we mean by this?
Yeah, all I'm asking is if that even exists.
Well, people obviously, I mean, yeah, I would be denying reality to say that people don't make propositions that they call moral propositions, right?
Yeah, and that content, presumably, because it's already of the world, right? The content of our beliefs is not just free floating, but it's intentionally related to the world.
Okay.
Okay, so that means it has to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah.
The normative content comes from the world.
Okay.
That's just to say that moral properties come from the world. Now, you could say something like, well, sure, there's moral content in the world that informs us or gives us reasons for what we ought to do, but those are always going to be tied towards their dispositions, which is what the moral subjectivist does.
Well, but okay, but what I don't understand, so it seems like I could invent literally anything and then say that that property comes from the world then, right? So chi, I want to say that chi is like energy or whatever, and I can make observations about this, and I could say, well, I can make propositions regarding, you know, things about chi, and I can make observations in the world. So does that make me like a chi realist now? Like, I don't understand what that means. Or I mean, I understand what that means. It just seems like that's not satisfying, or that's not pointing to the existence of something. That's just enough people come together, use a word, agree on it, and then all of a sudden that thing comes into existence. Or can you explain that?
Well, chi would be something that you could easily create an error theory for chi, right?
Well, yeah, but you're giving me arguments for what I imagine are like arguments in favor of like moral realism or underlying moral fact. So what I'm saying is, well, let's say I get a bunch of people and we agree that chi is a thing, and we all see everybody's energies and chi, and that's like blah, 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 blah. Well, now do we have like chi realists? Is that enough to establish chi realism, or?
Well, I think it would be until we had an error theory, but I think you can have probably an error theory for chi theory, right? That is, like, you could probably provide arguments for why we wouldn't believe in chi. So if I had a certain type of theory of chi, then it would probably have absolutely no real imminent consequences that we could verify or view in the world.
Well, but that's true of all morality, right? There's zero consequences for morality, right? Like if you murder somebody, nothing happens. It's not like a mountain falls over or a tree falls on you or lightning strikes or something, no?
Yeah, so there probably is some sort of, I mean, it depends, I guess. You'd have to, and this is where I think it starts getting tricky. I think that is a sort of problem, because then you'd have to deny that moral properties, or you'd have to find some sort of way of which moral properties have some sort of verification or falsification criterion. And there might be, I mean, they certainly have normativity. I certainly would deny that they have a normativity that's relational to the subject. I would just deny that, right? I think that you have to prove that ethical content always is related to the subject, because I think it's a more nuanced and more committed view to say that the sort of ethical content that we're generally dealing with, or the ethical judgments that we're sort of dealing with in general, have to be related to a subject, right? That's more complicated than just saying that they just exist implicitly, right? So I think it's the burden on the person to say that it is tailored towards a subject. But if you were to bring up your argument that we need a verification principle, yeah, I'd say that, like, the moral realist has to find a way of talking about a verification principle, or he would have to say that morality is in some way queer with respect to general epistemological judgment.
Yeah, but I mean, again, if we accept the queerness of morality in regards to epistemological judgment, I feel like we could literally do that with chi, right? Or with everything, no? Like, this is something that's unique in terms of justification. Yeah. Well, hold on, wait. Yeah. Well, I thought you said you were a moral realist, aren't you, right?
I am a moral realist.
So how do you resolve this personally?
The verification criterion?
Sure.
I don't have a solution to, like, the verification criterion, but I think that there's some epistemological statements that don't seem to be verifiable. So I don't know how to resolve those, right?
When you say that, are you talking about like very base, like axiomatic statements of like reason or logic or whatever, or what do you mean by that?
I mean, yeah, there's some epistemological non-verifiable statements like that, like mathematics and geometry and cetera,
yeah, but not, so like that, so for something like that, I can understand. So I don't know if I'm using these incorrectly, or I have a poor understanding of this, but like, so my understanding would be that something like mathematics ought to arise completely from like our a priori reasoning. That like if we have things like like identity statements or non-contradiction, that if we understand things like these, that from these very basic like a priori logics, we should be able to build everything we know from math. But I don't think that that type of a priori reasoning can ever build morality. I don't think you can get there from that. No?
Well, that's what I would be kind of reluctant to agree with you, right? I guess I would say that it's either the case that ethical judgments are verifiable and that we just need to find ways of verifying it, or two, if they weren't verifiable, then they would just be sort of a species of things that is sort of very similar to epistemological judgments done in logic. And
Well, why? So if you feel like you have no way to verify any sort of moral statement, and you feel like they require some sort of epistemic uniqueness, like these all seem like really good reasons to not believe in something, no? Or why? I guess why do you have to be a moral realist? Does that commit you, or are you committed to moral realism through some other thing that you believe in, or?
well, what I'm saying is that there doesn't seem to be a disparity between the sort of rational constraints that we see in epistemology and the rational constraints that we see in morality. So that would be my main reason for it.
But that puts like morality like on the same base level of understanding the universe and everything and all relational properties and everything as like epistemology. No, isn't that kind of not fair?
But I don't see a distinct. But so I think that there's a sort of marriage, if you will, between epistemology and ethics, right?
Lame. Sorry.
Because let's say that. Well, I mean, you can't really. I don't know if you can deny that. So, for example,
are you about to do the REM? All normativity is presupposed by morality. Is that where we're going? Tell me right now if we're heading the car right into that wall.
No, I'm just saying like there's a sort of marriage in another sense that like we're obviously going to justify morality using epistemology all the time, right? So, for example, I had a way of curing people. I could either try. I can either try shamanism, right, or I could actually seek actual medical doctors within the contemporary medical field. And based upon my epistemological answers, those can then inform my ethical results. But that just seems to me that that there seems to be a sort of marriage between epistemological and ethical norms, wouldn't you say?
But I mean, but the important part there, my understanding is that ethics is downstream necessarily from epistemology. They're not like, they don't run side by side. Like you would have to figure out like epistemic beliefs first, and then downstream from that you would get morality. But it sounds like in order to talk about morality, we're trying to say that those exist independent of some epistemic understanding. That's what it sounded like earlier. Maybe I misunderstood you.
That's also interesting, right? So these are points that were brought up, I think, historically as well, whether one is downstream and whether one is upstream. And there are some people like Fichte who actually think that practical reason, that is to say ethical reasoning, precedes theoretical reasoning. I don't know what I would choose there. I would probably say like they're just related but not reducible to one another. But their marriage seems to be, at least to me, like fairly intuitively
Okay, but that's not, because if I say, well, it's unintuitive to me, or do you?
No. I don't mean intuitive in that sense. I mean that we're literally doing inferences using one through the other, right? Like
we can have huge conversations about epistemology without ever having to invoke morality, right?
Yeah, but that doesn't show that they're not married.
I guess I guess it feels like at the end of all of this, like I'm no closer to having. So we agree that there's no sense data related to morality, that we can't gather information about it that way, and then it feels like morality.
No. I do think that there is some sort of moral content within the world that rationally constrains what choices that we should do.
Like how? Like what?
Well, so there would just be a certain type of property within the world that we'd be in or out of accordance with, right?
Yeah, like what property?
who'd be the moral properties themselves. It's like asking, like, well, where is the epistemological property itself, right?
Well, no, but
There's
okay,
no
wait, hold on.
epistemological property in
Yeah.
itself.
So okay, well, let's talk about this because this is what I don't agree with this. I don't think it's fair because if I want to put morality on the same level as epistemology, it feels like I can invent a million different things. We can go back to chi. Okay, well, chi it has it's like foundational. Like it feels like we're cheating there to say that. No. Like if somebody were to say, well, how can you tell me that chi exists? And I go, well, how can you prove causality, idiot? Like that doesn't feel, well, then I can I can invent a trillion different meaningless things. Like the difference is that epistemology seems necessary for us to have any content of our thoughts at all, right? That epistemology, serves as like some sort of description as necessary a priori understandings we have of the world. And without that, like everything devolves into absurdism. I don't think the same is true of morality at all, or it doesn't feel that way.
Are you talking about the disparity between, like, one entailing certain types of logical contradictions?
Yeah, I would think so. That epistemology describes logics that are necessarily true. That it would like, or my understanding of it is that like necessarily, like we couldn't exist without certain forms of logic in our life. So things like causality or deduction or identity or non-contradiction, that it's just inconceivable to not have these. But morality doesn't get to be put on the same level as that, right? We can conceive of
that all.
Go ahead.
I guess my problem with that, and I've heard that argument, Cowie makes that sort of argument. I guess my only real problem with that is it just doesn't seem like all empirical, observable norms are like have that push, right? It doesn't seem like everything that we believe has that same push.
What do you like? What though?
Like, I mean, like, if I was to not believe in certain types of things, like epistemological things, it doesn't seem like by not committing to those, I've done some sort of illogical move, right?
I mean, you can not commit to certain epistemic norms, I guess, but you're still going to be functioning within them perfectly, right? So, like, if we talk about causality, for instance, or whatever, like, you can't not believe in causality. You put one foot forward expecting it to do the same as it always has. You pour water out of a vase or a glass expecting it to flow into another. You turn the keys in your car expecting it to turn on. Or things like non-contradiction. You can say, well, I don't believe in non-contradiction, but you can't even imagine what it would be like for something to simultaneously have and not have some property, or to have two properties that contradict one another. That you're like, if anything, like epistemology is like an explanation of our a priori reasoning that is necessarily like entailed in being a human, is my understanding.
Yeah, but you can't have two contradictory moral statements either.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It depends on your it depends on your moral system, I guess. Well, I mean, obviously everybody's.
But any sort of, I mean, unless you're a complete particularist, which that doesn't make much sense to me in terms of morality. You have to have some sort of universal criterion of which you judge consistency, right?
Sure, but the difference is that at the end of the day, like when it comes to things like when it comes to things like deductive reasoning or causality or identity, like these are things that are like evident, like through sense data as well. I don't know if we need sense data necessarily to verify things like epistemology, but like it'll play out the same in the real world too. That like in the real world, if I have like two blocks,
well, I would reject that these are just evident.
Like, what do you mean? Or like, can you give me an example, I guess, of some a priori knowledge that wouldn't also be evident in the real world?
No, I'm not talking about a priori knowledge right here. I'm just talking about epistemic norms, right, that are in the world that you hold, right? Well, presumably you hold the epistemic norm that when you go outside of your house, like you have a car outside of your house, right?
Yeah.
So like, yeah, you're justified in your belief that there's a car outside because of other types of beliefs, and those beliefs are in virtue of other beliefs, so on and so forth, right? Until you get to all these sorts of constellation of beliefs. And I'm saying there's a perfect symmetry between that commitment and, say, moral commitments, right?
No, wait, how? I don't understand. Or what do you mean by that?
Because they both have the same type of universality to them. They're both they both thrive off of rational relations in the constellation of commitments.
Yeah, but the difference is that our relations, it feels like the relations in terms of what we were talking about earlier with my car, like is developed in a way different way. It's like the marriage of like your a priori reasoning plus your sense data. I know that my car is outside because I've seen my car outside. I've walked inside. I have an understanding of the relationships between the distance between the places. I have no reason to believe someone else is moving my car. Like I have like reasons for all of that. But we can build the same type of things with morality. Yeah, but none of that can be reduced to any type of observation whatsoever. And
I don't think so. So I don't think our moral beliefs are, well, I don't think, yeah, I think our moral, what's a good way of phrasing it?
Wait, okay, I'll give you the last word on this, okay? Because I have to go talk to the guy, so go. Hit me up.
Which guy are you going to talk about?
Or I have to talk to the perspective philosophy guy. That's what I'm here for. So go. So hit me up with your final. Give me the final response to that. Go for it.
Shit. I kind of lost my train. Oh yeah, I think that in the sense that we're talking about like a sort of consistency of norms, right, and justification of different types of rational beliefs. I think there's a symmetry between that and moral beliefs because we don't come across what we morally believe, just like that, right? I mean, like we don't have like irreducible normative particular descriptions. We always seem to justify our morality in virtue of other types of beliefs, and they do seem to be located within experiences because they're not just free floating, right? We just don't come up with moral beliefs without at least engaging in some sort of with some sort of perceptual activity. It's just that the perceptual activity doesn't have that same type of quality it does with, right? It would just be moral quality.
Okay. All right. I'm going to talk to the dude. I love you, buddy. But I also hate you. But I love you more than I hate you.
Wait.
What?
Where's this going on?
He just wants me to call him because we need video, so.
Oh, okay.
All right. Be careful, bud.
Bye-bye.
When you say what is right, I would say what is right for them. I don't like or do anything with meta ethics at all. I don't know if I believe in an overall